The standoff continued for long, tense moments as more Empire soldiers moved to protect Bridge. Commander Thax found himself increasingly isolated, his rigid ideology crumbling in the face of his own troops' rebellion against orders to harm a child. "You are all traitors," Thax screamed, his weapon swinging wildly between the soldiers and Bridge. Corrupted by human sentiment, "I will report this to the High Council." Bridge stepped forward again, his small hand reaching toward his uncle's weapon. "Uncle Thax, Bridge not want hurt anyone. Bridge just want family to be safe and happy." The simple statement broke something in the commander. For a moment his weapon wavered and Thomas caught a glimpse of uncertainty in the crimson eyes, but fanaticism won out, and Thax's grip tightened on his weapon. "I will not let the Empire fall to mongrel sentiment," he snarled, taking aim at Bridge. But as his finger moved toward the firing stud, Bridge did something that changed everything. The child began to sing. It wasn't the cry of a frightened infant or the wail of a child in distress. It was a song that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his young throat. A melody that combined the mathematical precision of draconian music with the emotional resonance of human expression. The sound was unlike anything any of them had ever heard, beautiful and haunting and somehow familiar to every soul present. The effect was immediate and profound. Every weapon lowered as soldiers from both ships found themselves entranced by the music. Even Commander Thax's arm dropped to his side as the song washed over him. In the melody they heard echoes of home, of love, of everything they had left behind to fight an increasingly senseless war. Bridge's song told the story of two peoples who had forgotten they were not so different. It spoke of loss and longing, of the foolishness of hatred and of the possibility of healing. Though the child used no words, every listener understood the message perfectly. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face as he listened to his adopted son's incredible gift. Beside him, Zara was openly weeping, her scales shimmering with the light of profound emotion. Around them, hardened soldiers were lowering their heads in shame and recognition. When the song ended, the silence was absolute. Then, one by one, the Empire soldiers began removing their helmets, revealing faces marked by wonder and confusion and dawning understanding. "By the ancient stars," one of them whispered. "What are we doing here? What has this war cost us?" Commander Thax stood frozen, his weapon hanging uselessly at his side. For the first time since they had known him, the fanatical certainty was gone from his eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like pain. Bridge walked up to his uncle and placed a tiny hand on the commander's armored leg. "Uncle's sad because Uncle forgot how to love," the child said gently. "Bridge, help Uncle remember." Thax knelt slowly until he was at eye level with his nephew. "Child," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "what have I become? What have we all become?" "Uncle is lost," Bridge replied with the infinite compassion that seemed to be his greatest gift. "But lost can be found. Family helps family find way home." Thomas watched in amazement as the most feared commander in the Empire began to break down, years of rigid ideology cracking under the gentle pressure of a child's unconditional love. Around them, soldiers were beginning to talk among themselves, questioning everything they had believed about the war and their purpose. One of the soldiers approached Zara respectfully. "My lady," he said, "forgive us. We came here believing we were protecting the Empire from contamination. But looking at your child, hearing his song, we see only beauty and wisdom." Zara nodded graciously. "There is nothing to forgive. You followed your orders and your beliefs, but perhaps now you can see that those beliefs were based on fear rather than truth." Over the following hours, something unprecedented occurred. Empire soldiers began removing their armor and sitting in Thomas's field, talking with their former enemy about family, about home, about the cost of endless war. Bridge moved among them like a tiny diplomat, listening to their stories and offering the kind of comfort that transcended species barriers. Thomas found himself in conversation with soldiers who spoke of missing their children, of wondering why they were fighting, of hoping for a future where their own young ones might know peace. They were not monsters, he realized, just people caught up in a system that had forgotten its purpose. Commander Thax sat apart from the others, struggling with the collapse of everything he had believed. Bridge eventually made his way to his uncle's side and climbed onto his lap, offering the simple comfort of physical contact. "Uncle's heart very tired," Bridge observed. Fighting makes everything hurt. Maybe time to stop fighting? Thax looked down at the child who carried both his bloodline and that of the supposed enemy. Little Starwalker, he said, using Zara's pet name for Bridge. You make it seem so simple. Love is simple, Bridge replied. Hate is what makes things complicated. As the sun began to set over the farm, Thomas realized that something extraordinary had happened. A child barely 1 year old had accomplished what armies and diplomats had failed to achieve. He had shown a group of soldiers that the enemy they had been fighting was not so different from themselves. The Empire ships remained in orbit, but their purpose had changed. Instead of weapons of war, they had become vessels of possibility. The soldiers were already talking about returning home with a new message, about the child who had shown them a different way. This is just the beginning, Zara said as she watched Bridge play with soldiers who hours earlier had come to kill him. Word of what happened here will spread throughout the Empire. There will be those who resist the message, but there will also be those ready to embrace it. Thomas nodded, understanding that their quiet life on the farm was over. Bridge would need to be protected, nurtured, and eventually prepared for the role he seemed destined to play in galactic affairs. But for now, it was enough that he was safe, loved, and surrounded by family that had grown to include former enemies. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Bridge flew up to hover between Thomas and Zara, his small wings beating steadily as he looked toward the future, with eyes full of hope and determination. He was no longer just a child hidden in a barn. He was the bridge between worlds, and his journey was just beginning. The galaxy would never be the same. And perhaps, Thomas thought as he watched his remarkable son, that was exactly what it needed. Sometimes the most powerful force in the universe wasn't weapons or technology or ancient hatred. Sometimes it was simply love, offered without conditions by a child who saw possibilities where others saw only problems. Bridge smiled at both his parents, then began to sing again, his voice carrying across the farm and toward the stars, where other worlds waited to hear his message of hope. The Empire ships descended through Earth's atmosphere like silver daggers cutting through the morning sky. 3 massive vessels, each the size of a city block, took positions over Thomas's farm. Their scanning beams swept across the property in methodical patterns, searching for any trace of the fugitive who had crashed here months ago. In the underground home, Thomas checked their defensive systems one final time. Zara had helped him install energy dampeners and signal scramblers, but she warned him that Empire technology was incredibly sophisticated. They might have minutes before being discovered, or they might already be detected. Bridge needs to stay hidden, Thomas said firmly as he prepared to go to the surface. Whatever happens, you two stay down here where it's safe. No, Bridge said with startling authority for a child not yet 1 year old. Family stays together. Bridge not afraid of Empire. Zara placed a protective wing around her son while looking at Thomas with conflicted emotions. He's right about staying together, she said quietly. If we're discovered separately, they might harm you while trying to reach us. Together we have a better chance. Thomas knew she was right, but the thought of exposing Bridge to danger went against every protective instinct he'd developed. Still, their child had shown remarkable wisdom in his short life. Perhaps it was time to trust that wisdom. The surface scanners were getting closer. Through their monitoring systems, they could see Empire soldiers beginning to deploy from the ships. Tall, elegant beings in powered armor, they moved with military precision as they established a perimeter around the crash site. They're not just searching, Zara observed, watching the tactical deployment. They're preparing for a confrontation. Someone important is aboard those ships. As if summoned by her words, a 4th vessel descended from orbit. Smaller than the others but radiating an aura of authority, it landed directly in Thomas's cornfield. The door opened to reveal a figure that made Zara gasp in recognition. Commander Thax, she whispered, my former mate, Bridge's uncle. He leads the Empire's pureblood faction. Thomas felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just a search and rescue mission. This was a family vendetta, and they were caught in the middle of it. The commander emerged from his ship, his scales a deep crimson that seemed to absorb light. Where Zara was graceful and elegant, Thack radiated barely controlled violence. He was larger than Zara, more heavily muscled, and his eyes burned with fanatic intensity as he surveyed the crash site. Zara of the Golden Wing, his voice boomed across the farm, amplified by his armor's speakers. I know you survived. I know you carry the abomination. Surrender now and your death will be swift. Bridge pressed against his mother's side, but Thomas was amazed to see no fear in the child's eyes. Instead, there was anger. Pure, righteous anger at the threat to his family. Bad dragon calls Bridge names, the child said with startling clarity. Bridge show him who is abomination. Before either parent could stop him, Bridge walked to the concealed exit and began climbing toward the surface. Thomas and Zara exchanged one desperate look before following their incredibly brave and incredibly foolish child. They emerged from their hidden home to find themselves surrounded by Empire soldiers. Energy weapons powered up as the soldiers recognized the fugitives, but Commander Thax raised a hand to halt any aggressive action. His crimson eyes focused on Bridge with a mixture of fascination and disgust. So, Thax said, his voice dripping with disdain, this is the mongrel that has caused so much trouble. Barely more than a hatchling, yet already corrupted by human contamination. Thomas stepped protectively in front of Bridge, his old shotgun feeling pathetically inadequate against the advanced weapons surrounding them. Leave the child alone, he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Whatever your problem is with Zara, Bridge hasn't done anything wrong. Thax laughed, a sound like grinding metal. Human, you understand nothing. This creature's very existence is wrong. It represents the pollution of pure draconian bloodlines, the destruction of everything our empire stands for. Bridge, not creature, the child said, walking around Thomas to face his uncle directly. Despite being barely 3 feet tall compared to Thax's imposing 8-foot frame, Bridge showed no intimidation. Bridge is family. Bridge is love. Bridge is future. The simple words, spoken in a child's voice that carried both human warmth and draconian musical tones, seemed to affect some of the soldiers. Thomas noticed several of them lowering their weapons slightly, looking uncertain. Zara stepped forward, placing herself between her son and her former mate. Thax, look at him. Really look. He's beautiful, intelligent, perfect. He could be the bridge between our peoples that ends this war. There can be no bridge, Thax snarled. Only purity or extinction. The humans must be destroyed and their contamination purged from our bloodlines. Bridge walked up to his uncle with the fearless confidence that only children possess. Uncle Thax sad, he said matter-of-factly. Uncle Thax afraid. Fear makes heart small and angry. The commander's eyes blazed with fury. I am not afraid of some hybrid abomination. Yes, Bridge replied calmly. Uncle afraid Bridge shows love is stronger than hate. Afraid mixing makes better, not worse. Afraid Uncle been wrong about everything. Thomas watched in amazement as their young child faced down one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, with nothing but truth and compassion. Around them, Empire soldiers were beginning to murmur among themselves, clearly affected by the confrontation. Commander Thax raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Bridge. Enough, I will end this corruption now. But before he could fire, something unexpected happened. One of his own soldiers stepped between the commander and the child, weapon lowered. Sir? The soldier said respectfully but firmly. Permission to speak? Denied. Thax roared, but other soldiers were beginning to move, creating a protective circle around Bridge, Thomas, and Zara. Commander, another soldier said, the child shows no aggression, no threat. He speaks of love and family. Are these not values our empire claims to protect? Bridge looked up at the soldiers who had moved to protect him, his young face glowing with gratitude. Thank you, he said simply. Bridge, glad you see with heart, not just eyes. Thomas realized that something profound was happening. Their child was doing exactly what he had said he would do. He was showing the Empire that mixing didn't create monsters, it created bridges. And some of them were finally beginning to see. The underground home took shape over the following months, becoming far more sophisticated than Thomas had originally envisioned. Zara's engineering knowledge proved invaluable, as they created a 3-chamber system connected by curved tunnels that followed natural drainage patterns. The main living area was spacious enough for Zara to move comfortably, with high ceilings that accommodated her full height and wingspan. They had installed geothermal heating, solar power systems hidden among the trees, and even a sophisticated air filtration system based on draconian environmental technology. The home was completely self-sufficient and virtually undetectable from the surface. The entrance was concealed beneath what appeared to be a natural depression in the woods, accessible only through a camouflaged hatch. Bridge, now 6 months old, had grown remarkably. He stood nearly as tall as a human toddler and could fly with increasing skill and confidence. His intelligence had developed to the point where he understood complex conversations in both languages and could express his own needs and wants with remarkable clarity. The child's scales had stabilized into a beautiful pattern that shifted between his mother's green gold and a warm amber color that seemed uniquely his own. "Thomas," Bridge said clearly one morning, his first complete word in English. Zara's eyes filled with what Thomas had learned were tears of joy in her species. The child had been making sounds that resembled both their names for weeks, but this was the first clear pronunciation. "Bridge," Thomas replied, kneeling to the child's level. "That's right, buddy. I'm Thomas." The name Bridge had stuck, though Zara had given him a formal draconian name that translated roughly to Starwalker Between Worlds. Thomas thought Bridge was more appropriate for daily use, and Zara had agreed. Life in their hidden home had settled into comfortable routines. Mornings were spent maintaining the surface farm, which had become more profitable than ever thanks to Zara's agricultural innovations. Her soil enhancement techniques and crop rotation methods had increased yields dramatically, while reducing the need for expensive fertilizers and pesticides. Afternoons were family time in the underground home. Bridge would practice flying in the main chamber while Zara worked on various projects, and Thomas handled farm business from the concealed office they had built. Evenings were for education, with all three of them learning from each other. Thomas had become fascinated by draconian history and culture, while Zara absorbed human knowledge with remarkable speed. She had read every book Thomas owned and had begun making observations about human psychology and social structures that often surprised him with their insight. "Humans are remarkably adaptable," she told him one evening as they watched Bridge practice aerial maneuvers. "Most species in the galaxy are specialists. You are generalists, able to function in almost any environment or situation. This is why the Empire fears you. But your people are clearly more advanced technologically," Thomas replied. "Why would they fear us?" Zara considered her answer carefully. Technology can be copied, learned, stolen. But adaptability, creativity, the ability to thrive in chaos, these are inherent traits. Humans don't just survive change, you use it as an opportunity. This makes you unpredictable, and the Empire values predictability above all else. Bridge had been listening to their conversation while practicing hovering techniques. At 6 months, his comprehension was already approaching adult levels, though his emotional development was still that of a child. He landed gracefully near them and added his own perspective. "Empire scared of different," he said in his melodic voice that blended human speech patterns with draconian tonal qualities. "Bridge is different. Bridge is scary to Empire." The simple statement from their remarkable child highlighted the reality they all understood but rarely discussed. Bridge wasn't just unique. He was potentially dangerous to the established order of galactic society. His very existence challenged the Empire's fundamental beliefs about species purity and hierarchy. Thomas had been following galactic news through encrypted channels Zara had shown him how to access. The war between humans and Draconians was intensifying, with both sides becoming more entrenched in their positions. There were rumors of secret weapons being developed, super soldiers being created, and entire planets being evacuated or destroyed. "The galaxy is tearing itself apart," Thomas said as they reviewed the latest reports. "And here we are, proving that cooperation is not only possible but beneficial to everyone involved." "Perhaps that is why Bridge exists," Zara replied thoughtfully. "Not accident, but necessity. The galaxy needs bridge between species, and Bridge is that bridge." Their peaceful existence was interrupted one cold winter morning, when Thomas detected unusual electromagnetic signatures on the monitoring equipment Zara had helped him install. Ships were approaching Earth, and their energy patterns matched Galactic Empire vessels. "They found us," Zara said, her voice calm despite the fear Thomas could see in her eyes. "The Empire has finally decided to investigate the crash site." Thomas felt his heart race as he considered their options. They had prepared for this possibility, but the reality was still terrifying. "The underground home is undetectable, right? We just need to stay hidden until they leave." "It's not that simple," Zara explained. "Empire technology can detect life signs, energy patterns, even genetic traces. If they conduct a thorough search, they will eventually find us." Bridge, who had been playing quietly in the corner, suddenly stood up with an expression of determination that was startling in one so young. "Bridge not hide anymore," he said firmly. "Bridge show Empire that different is not scary." Thomas and Zara exchanged glances. Their child was suggesting something incredibly dangerous, but there was a wisdom in his words that was hard to ignore. Running and hiding would only postpone the inevitable confrontation. "What are you proposing, little Starwalker?" Zara asked gently. Bridge looked up at both his parents with eyes that held far too much understanding for his age. "Bridge show Empire that human and draconian can be family. Bridge prove mixing makes strong, not weak." Thomas knelt beside the child who had become his son in every way that mattered. "That's very brave, Bridge, but it's also very dangerous. The Empire might try to hurt you." "Thomas and Zara protect Bridge," the child replied with absolute confidence. "And Bridge protect Thomas and Zara. Family protects family." As alarms began sounding on their monitoring equipment, indicating that the Empire ships were entering Earth's atmosphere, Thomas realized that their time of hiding was over. Whether they chose it or not, they were about to become the test case for whether two species could overcome generations of hatred and fear. The future of human-draconian relations might well depend on what happened in the next few hours. 3 months had passed since the crash, and the barn had been transformed into something resembling a home. Thomas had installed insulation, better lighting, and even a small wood stove for warmth as autumn approached. Zara had proven remarkably handy with tools, her precise claws allowing her to work with delicate mechanical components in ways Thomas never could. Bridge was developing at an astounding rate. At 3 months, he was already crawling with remarkable speed and coordination. His wing buds had grown into small but functional wings, and he could glide short distances from the hayloft to the barn floor. His scales were becoming more pronounced, creating beautiful patterns across his skin that shifted color with his emotions. The child's intelligence was perhaps most remarkable of all. Bridge understood both English and Zara's musical draconian language, responding appropriately to complex instructions from both his mother and Thomas. He seemed to absorb information like a sponge, watching everything with bright, curious eyes that missed nothing. Thomas had established routines that kept them all safe and busy. Early mornings were for farm work, maintaining the appearance of normal operations. Afternoons were spent in the barn, where Zara helped with equipment maintenance while Bridge explored and played. Evenings were for learning, with Zara teaching Thomas about her people's technology and culture, while he shared human knowledge and history. The relationship between Thomas and Zara had evolved beyond simple cooperation. She had proven to be brilliant, understanding complex mechanical and agricultural concepts quickly, and contributing innovations that improved farm efficiency. Her people, she explained, had been agricultural experts before becoming spacefaring. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that she had found refuge with a farmer. "Your crops could yield 30% more with proper mineral supplementation," Zara told him one afternoon, reviewing his soil analysis with keen interest. Draconian agricultural techniques could adapt to Earth conditions. Thomas watched her calculate optimal planting patterns with mathematical precision that put his agricultural college education to shame. "You're saying you could help me save the farm?" "We help each other," she replied, her English now nearly fluent. "This is partnership, yes?" The word partnership carried weight between them. Thomas had begun to think of Zara not as a refugee he was helping, but as a friend and colleague. Her presence had brought purpose back to his life in ways he was still discovering. Bridge's development continued to amaze them both. The child had begun making sounds that weren't quite words but carried clear meaning. When he wanted to be picked up, fed, or played with, his communications were unmistakable. More remarkably, he seemed to understand the necessity of staying quiet when strangers approached. The real test came when Dr. Sarah Martinez, the local veterinarian, made an unexpected visit. Thomas had called her about a genuine problem with one of his cows, but her timing couldn't have been worse. Bridge was playing in the main area of the barn when her truck pulled up. Zara moved with lightning speed, gathering Bridge and disappearing into their hidden space just as Dr. Martinez entered the barn. Thomas's heart pounded as he led her to the genuinely sick cow, hoping Bridge wouldn't make any sounds that would give them away. "Tom, this animal has a severe infection," Dr. Martinez said after her examination. "We need to start antibiotics immediately, and I'll need to come back daily for monitoring." Daily visits. Thomas's mind raced as he considered the implications. How long will the treatment take? At least a week, maybe 2. But Tom, I have to ask, is everything okay here? Your farm looks better than it has in years, but you seem nervous about something. Thomas forced himself to stay calm. Just worried about the cow. Can't afford to lose any livestock right now. Dr. Martinez administered the first dose of antibiotics and scheduled her next visit. After she left, Thomas found Zara and Bridge in their hiding spot, the baby sleeping peacefully despite the disruption. This cannot continue, Zara said quietly. Too dangerous for Bridge? For you. Thomas knew she was right, but the thought of them leaving filled him with unexpected dread. Over the past months, they had become his family in ways he hadn't anticipated. The farm felt alive again with their presence. Maybe it's time to expand our operation, Thomas said slowly. I've been thinking about that back section of the property. It's isolated, hidden by trees. We could build something there. A real home. Zara's eyes brightened with interest. Underground structure? Like draconian colony buildings? They spent the evening planning. Zara's knowledge of construction techniques, combined with Thomas's understanding of local building codes and material availability, produced designs for an underground home that would be virtually undetectable from the surface. It would take months to build, but it would provide true safety and comfort. The next morning brought a different kind of challenge. Bridge had discovered he could fly properly, not just glide. Thomas found him hovering 3 feet off the ground, tiny wings beating rapidly as he explored the barn from an entirely new perspective. The joy on the child's face was unmistakable, but so was the need for even greater caution. Flying means freedom for draconian children, Zara explained as they watched Bridge perform aerial loops with increasing confidence. But also means greater danger of discovery. Thomas watched the child's pure delight in his newfound ability and made a decision. Then we build that underground home as fast as possible. Bridge needs room to grow and be himself. That afternoon they began the secret construction project. Working carefully during times when no one could observe them, they started excavating the foundation for their hidden home. Zara's strength made the physical work go quickly, while Thomas handled the technical aspects of structural engineering and utilities. Bridge seemed to understand that something important was happening. He watched their work with intense interest, occasionally trying to help by moving small tools with his tiny hands. The child was becoming more human-like in some ways while also developing distinctly draconian characteristics. His intelligence continued to amaze both adults. As the weeks passed, Thomas realized that he wasn't just building a hiding place. He was building a future for all 3 of them. The farm, once a burden threatening to drag him into bankruptcy, was becoming a sanctuary where 2 species could learn to live together in harmony. The underground home would be their fortress, but it would also be their laboratory for proving that cooperation between humans and draconians was not only possible, but beneficial. Bridge would grow up knowing both heritages, carrying the best of both worlds into whatever future awaited them. The first week brought challenges Thomas had never imagined. Zara was slowly recovering from the birth, but caring for a newborn hybrid required constant adaptation. The baby, whom Thomas had started calling Bridge in his mind, seemed to grow and develop at an accelerated rate. By the 3rd day, the infant was already showing remarkable coordination and awareness. Communication remained their biggest obstacle until Thomas had a breakthrough. While cleaning the barn, he accidentally knocked over a bucket, and Zara immediately responded with a series of musical tones that somehow conveyed concern and a question. Thomas realized she was asking if he was hurt. When he shook his head and smiled, she made a different sound, clearly relief. From that moment, they began building their own language. Zara would make sounds and Thomas would respond with actions or gestures until they understood each other. She was an incredibly quick learner, and within days she was picking up English words with remarkable speed. Her vocal cords could reproduce human speech, though with a musical quality that made even simple words sound beautiful. Thomas, she said on the 5th day, carefully pronouncing his name. It was the first English word she spoke clearly, and hearing it in her melodic voice brought tears to his eyes. Zara, he replied, using the name she had taught him through gestures and sounds. She had pointed to herself and made a sound like wind chimes, which he interpreted as best he could. The baby was thriving beyond all expectations. Bridge was already attempting to crawl, tiny scales shimmering as he moved through the hay. The wing buds on his back were growing rapidly, and Thomas suspected the child would be flying much sooner than anyone might expect. The combination of human adaptability and draconian natural abilities was creating something entirely unique. Feeding had initially been a concern, but Zara's dietary needs proved surprisingly similar to humans. She could eat most of what Thomas provided, though she showed a strong preference for fresh vegetables and fish when he could provide it. The baby nursed normally, growing stronger each day. Thomas found himself making regular trips to town for supplies, always careful to vary his shopping patterns so no one would notice his increased purchases. He bought extra food, medical supplies, and books about child development, though he doubted any human research applied to their situation. The real test came on the 7th day when Sheriff Jim Robertson stopped by for his monthly social call. Thomas saw the patrol car coming up the long drive and felt his heart race. He quickly warned Zara, who gathered Bridge and retreated to the hidden loft space Thomas had prepared for emergencies. "Afternoon, Tom," the sheriff called as he approached the house. "Thought I'd check in, see how you're doing out here." Thomas forced himself to act normally, offering coffee and conversation about the weather and crops. But Sheriff Robertson seemed unusually observant, his eyes scanning the property with professional interest. "Had any unusual activity out here lately?" the sheriff asked casually. "Got a report about some kind of aircraft or meteor last week. Folks saw lights in the sky heading this direction." Thomas's mouth went dry. "Can't say I noticed anything special. You know how it is during harvest season. I'm usually dead asleep by 9. The sheriff nodded but continued his visual survey. "Mind if I take a quick look around?" "Just routine, you understand." Thomas couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. He led the sheriff around the property, carefully avoiding the barn. But as they passed near it, a soft sound drifted out. Bridge was fussing, making the unique sound that was part human cry, part something else entirely. Sheriff Robertson stopped. "That your cow?" Thomas thought quickly. "New calf. Been having some complications. Might need to call the vet." The sheriff accepted the explanation, but Thomas could see the man's curiosity was aroused. After Robertson left, Thomas knew they had to be even more careful. Word would spread if anyone heard or saw something they couldn't explain. That evening, he sat with Zara and Bridge in the barn, discussing their situation and their growing shared vocabulary. Zara understood the danger better than he had initially realized. She explained, through words and gestures, that the Galactic Empire had vast surveillance networks. If they discovered her location, they would come for her and the child. "But why?" Thomas asked. "What's so dangerous about a baby?" Zara's expression grew sad as she explained. Her people and humans had been at war for generations. The Empire believed that any mixing of the species would create beings too powerful to control. Bridge represented their greatest fear, a child who might possess the best qualities of both races. "Empire says mixing makes weakness," she said carefully in her improving English. "But they fear mixing makes strength." Thomas looked at Bridge, sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. The baby seemed impossibly perfect, combining human curiosity and adaptability with draconian intelligence and natural abilities. Perhaps the Empire's fears were justified. Perhaps this child really could represent something that would change the balance of power in the galaxy. That night, Thomas made modifications to the barn, creating better hiding spaces and soundproofing areas where Zara and Bridge could retreat if necessary. He also began planning for longer-term solutions. They couldn't hide in a barn forever. As he worked, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed in just 1 week. A few days ago, his biggest concern had been paying the mortgage. Now he was harboring refugees from a galactic empire and helping to raise a child who might hold the key to peace between species that had been enemies for centuries. The responsibility was overwhelming, but as he watched Zara gently rock her baby to sleep, Thomas knew he had found something worth fighting for. This wasn't just about one mother and child anymore. It was about proving that different species could live together, help each other, and create something beautiful from their differences. Bridge stirred in his sleep, tiny hands reaching toward the light filtering through the barn windows. In that moment, Thomas saw not a dangerous hybrid or an abomination, but simply a baby who deserved the chance to grow up safe and loved. Dawn was breaking over the farm when the real labor began. Thomas had spent the night learning to read Zara's expressions and gestures, their communication evolving beyond words. She would point to what she needed, and somehow he understood. Water, clean cloths, a softer place to rest. His veterinary experience was proving invaluable, though he suspected bringing a dragon hybrid into the world would be unlike anything he'd ever done. Zara's contractions intensified as the sun climbed higher. Her scales shifted colors rapidly, cycling through deep purples and bright golds in patterns Thomas was beginning to recognize as expressions of pain and determination. She was incredibly strong, even in her weakened state. When she gripped the wooden support beam during a particularly intense contraction, her claws left deep gouges in the oak. Thomas tried to remember everything he could about difficult births. Position was crucial.
He gently encouraged Zara to shift, using gestures and soft words.
She seemed to understand, adjusting herself with his help. Her breathing was becoming more rapid, and he could see the exhaustion taking its toll. The morning wore on, and Thomas began to worry. In his experience with animals, prolonged labor often meant complications. He wished desperately for his late wife Sarah, who had assisted him in countless animal births. She would have known what to do. But he was alone with this magnificent creature who had trusted him with the most vulnerable moment of her life. Around midday, something changed. Zara's eyes widened with a new urgency, and she made a low, musical sound that somehow conveyed both fear and anticipation. Thomas positioned himself to help, his hand steady despite his racing heart. He had delivered hundreds of calves, but this was different. This was someone's child. The baby emerged slowly, carefully, Thomas's experienced hands guiding the process. The infant was smaller than he'd expected, about the size of a human newborn, but with distinctive features from both parents. Tiny scales covered parts of the skin, shifting between the mother's green-gold coloration and a softer, more human-like tone. Small wing buds were visible on the back, and the eyes, when they opened, held an intelligence that took Thomas's breath away. Zara reached for her child with trembling hands, her exhaustion forgotten in the moment of first contact. She cradled the baby against her chest, and Thomas watched as both mother and child seemed to glow with a soft, warm light. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. The infant was a perfect blend of both species, human enough to seem familiar, but with the magnificent heritage of the draconian people clearly visible. The baby's eyes were large and expressive, already focusing on the mother's face with remarkable awareness. When the child opened its mouth, the sound was neither fully human cry nor dragon call, but something uniquely its own. Thomas busied himself with the practical matters, cleaning up and making sure both mother and child were comfortable. He brought fresh water and some of his emergency food supplies, unsure what a dragon might eat, but knowing she needed nourishment after the ordeal. To his surprise, Zara accepted the simple bread and milk gratefully. As the afternoon settled into evening, Thomas found himself sitting in the hay beside them, watching the new family bond. The baby seemed remarkably alert for a newborn, its eyes tracking movement and sounds with unusual focus. When Thomas moved closer, the infant turned toward him with curiosity rather than fear. Zara looked at Thomas with an expression of profound gratitude. She reached out slowly, carefully, and touched his weathered hand with one clawed finger. The gesture spoke volumes. Thank you. Trust. Recognition of the extraordinary kindness he had shown. Thomas understood that his life had changed forever in the space of a single day. Yesterday he had been a struggling farmer facing bankruptcy and loneliness. Today he was, what? Guardian to refugees from space? Protector of a mother and child who represented something unprecedented in the galaxy? The practical problems were already mounting in his mind. How do you hide a 12-foot dragon and her hybrid child? What did they eat? How long could they stay safe here? And what happened when the Galactic Empire came looking for them? But as he watched the baby's tiny hand curl around its mother's finger, Thomas knew he would face whatever came. This child represented hope, the possibility of understanding between species that had been enemies. More than that, it represented innocence in need of protection. The barn felt different now, charged with possibility and purpose. Outside, the world continued its normal rotation, unaware that something extraordinary had just happened in a simple farmer's barn. But inside, three beings from two different worlds had formed an unlikely family, bound together by trust, compassion, and the miracle of new life. As night fell, Thomas brought additional blankets and settled in to keep watch. Zara and her baby slept peacefully in the hay, and Thomas found himself planning. The barn would need modifications for permanent residents. He'd need to research nutrition, safety, communication methods. His solitary life was over, replaced by something far more complex and infinitely more meaningful. The child would need a name, Thomas realized as he watched the peaceful scene. Something that honored both heritage and the hope for a future where such a child could exist without fear. Something that spoke to the bridge this baby represented between two very different kinds of people. The escape pod crashed through Earth's atmosphere like a dying star, leaving a brilliant streak across the midnight sky. Zara's massive wings folded protectively around her swollen belly as the pod tumbled end over end, emergency systems screaming warnings in a dozen galactic languages. Her iridescent scales, once the pride of the draconian nobility, were now dull with exhaustion and fear. The Galactic Empire had abandoned her, cast out for the crime of carrying a hybrid child, deemed an abomination by the Council of Pure Bloodlines. The father, a human diplomat she had loved in secret, was executed before he even knew of their child's existence. Now she was alone, pregnant, and hurtling toward a backwater planet the Empire considered beneath notice. The pod struck the Earth with devastating force, carving a furrow through a cornfield before coming to rest against a weathered wooden fence. Steam hissed from ruptured coolant lines as Zara struggled to free herself from the wreckage. Her magnificent form, nearly 12 feet from snout to tail tip, emerged from the twisted metal. Blood seeped from cuts along her neck and shoulders, mixing with the strange rain that had begun to fall. Thomas McKinnon heard the crash from his farmhouse kitchen, where he sat nursing his third cup of coffee and reviewing bills he couldn't pay. The 50-year-old farmer had worked this land his entire life, watching it slowly die as corporate agriculture swallowed up family farms across the Midwest. His wife Sarah had passed 2 years ago from cancer they couldn't afford to treat properly, leaving him alone with acres of struggling crops and a mountain of debt. He grabbed his shotgun and a flashlight, more from habit than fear. Probably another military training exercise, he thought. The government rarely warned rural folks about their activities anymore. But as he approached the crash site, his light fell upon something that defied every assumption he'd ever held about the universe. The creature was magnificent and terrifying. Her scales shifted color in the light, from deep emerald to brilliant gold. Wings that could span a small aircraft were folded against her sides, and her eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably sentient. But it was her condition that stopped Thomas cold. She was obviously pregnant, her belly distended, and she was injured and afraid. Zara locked eyes with the human male. Her universal translator, damaged in the crash, managed only fragments of his language. She could sense his emotions, though, a gift of her people. Surprise, certainly. Fear, yes, but underneath it all, something else. Compassion. It had been so long since she'd felt that emotion directed toward her that she almost didn't recognize it. "Easy there," Thomas said softly, the same tone he'd used with frightened livestock. "I'm not going to hurt you." He set the shotgun down slowly, keeping his hands visible. The creature's breathing was labored, and he could see the pain in her posture. Zara tried to speak, but only managed a low rumble in her throat. The translator sparked and died completely. She gestured weakly toward her belly, then toward the ruined pod. Her message was clear enough. She needed help, and she needed it soon. Thomas made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Come on," he said, pointing toward his barn. "Let's get you out of this rain." He began walking slowly toward the structure, looking back to see if she would follow. After a moment's hesitation, Zara pushed herself upright on unsteady legs and followed the human through the corn rows. Her people had always taught that humans were primitive, violent, barely more than clever animals. But this one had shown her more kindness in 5 minutes than the Empire had in months. The barn was old but solid, built by Thomas's grandfather from native timber. Hay bales were stacked high against one wall, and the air smelled of earth and growing things. Zara collapsed onto a pile of straw, her strength finally giving out. The human disappeared for a moment, returning with an armload of blankets and a first aid kit. Thomas had delivered enough calves and foals to recognize the signs. This creature, whatever she was going into labor. Her breathing came in short pants and her hands pressed against her swollen sides. He'd helped bring life into the world countless times, but never like this. "Okay," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Let's see what we can do." Zara felt another contraction grip her, stronger than before. Her child was coming, here on this alien world with only a strange human for company. But as the farmer's weathered hands moved with surprising gentleness to help her, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her exile began. Hope. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the empty cornfield, washing away the last traces of her former life. Inside the barn, two beings from different worlds worked together to bring new life into the universe. Thomas McKinnon, who had spent his life nurturing things from the earth, prepared to help deliver something infinitely more precious than any crop he'd ever grown. The Galactic Empire had abandoned her, but perhaps in this simple human farmer, Zara had found something better. A protector, a friend, and maybe even a father for the child who would soon enter the world caught between two species, belonging fully to neither, but loved by both.